plus $3 shipping. Use your credit card or send check or money order to Johnny Mathis, P.O. Box 8250, Atlanta, Georgia. Remember, save COD charges by sending check or money order or use your credit card.
This is CNN.
To our viewers around the world, good afternoon from Washington. I'm Frank Sesno.
And good evening from London. I'm Jim Clancy, sitting in for Hillary Bowker. Ahead this hour, Egypt's living and the dead. The country's hopes of finding any more survivors now buried with the bodies among the rubble from Monday's earthquake. Also ahead,
Andre Chikatilo, the world's worst serial killer, was frog-marched into court this morning to hear a judge pronounce him guilty on 52 counts of murder.
James Mates on a Russian serial killer and his 12-year murder spree.
And removing the remnants of the Persian Gulf War. The dangers, debris still littering the desert of Kuwait.
We begin in Cairo, where jittery residents dealing with the shock of Monday's earthquake are being jolted by the quake's aftershocks. 2 more tremors rocked the Egyptian capital today. The aftershocks sent panicked people running into the streets and brought more buildings crashing down. Egyptian President Hosni Mubarak says at least 450 people died in the quake. But amid the death and the rubble, a remarkable tale of survival. David Chater has that story.
They have to bury their dead quickly in the heat of Cairo. It's only the grief among the living that lingers. This is the personal cost of the tragedy, magnified in so many families throughout the city today. They're still finding more bodies in the rubble. Teams drawn from many nations, both Arab and European, are now helping with the task. The chances of finding survivors, though, are getting slender. The hospitals are still overcrowded with the injured, but medical aid is now flooding in from abroad. So far, only one person has been dug out alive from the debris, Samaya Amar. Today, I spoke to Samaya about her ordeal. She was in her kitchen on the 9th floor of the apartment block when the quake struck. She had just time to grab her 5-year-old boy before the building collapsed around them. She spent 9 hours listening to her rescuers getting nearer, holding close to her child as his life slipped away. Her husband described what happened.
She tried to talk to the kid to see that he's alive and hear his voice.
But 2 hours before rescue came, her boy died. I also spoke to 6-year-old Summer. She saw 2 of her classmates trampled to death in the rush to get out when the quake struck. Her mother knows she's lucky to have come out alive. The money the government is paying in compensation to all the families for their suffering can never be enough. At the hospital today, relatives crowded round as rumors spread that another survivor had been brought out alive, but it was soon clear the rumor was false. It's very hard to describe the feelings of the relatives waiting here at the hospital as each ambulance brings yet another dead body in. There can be no let-up yet in the search for survivors. David Chater, ITN, in Cairo.
In southern Russia today, a 56-year-old grandfather was convicted of 52 serial murders, many of his victims children. James Mates reports on the killer and his day in court.
Andre Chikatilo, the world's worst serial killer, was frog-marched into court this morning to hear a judge pronounce him guilty on 52 counts of murder. Handcuffed inside a steel cage, his victims' mothers and families had come to hear the verdict. They listened for a final time as a panel of judges read out details of each charge, of how for 12 years he had lured women, boys, and young girls into secluded spots, raped, murdered, and then horribly mutilated them. Chikatilo repeatedly interrupted with incoherent screams of abuse. Only a plea of insanity can save him from the firing squad. The judges ordered him to be taken away. Neither they nor police doctors accept that a man who skillfully escaped detection for 12 years is genuinely insane. As he left, the mother of one victim shouted, "You're a beast, an animal." Another demanded that he be executed. He must be shot, she told us. But first, I'd like to see him tortured the way he tortured our children. Andrei Chikatilo will be sentenced first thing tomorrow morning. An innocent man has already been wrongfully executed for one of the murders he committed. After today's verdict, it seems certain that he, too, will face the death penalty. James Mates, ITN, Rostov in southern Russia.
Gas lines into the city of Sarajevo are now being restored after being severed for 8 days. But people there are still struggling to get by without electricity and running water. The war ravaging this city has reduced its people to boiling rainwater and cooking with wood fires. Another visible sign of the war's brutality, a sad skeletal figure in the Sarajevo Zoo. The emaciated black bear is the zoo's sole survivor. The animal hardly has enough strength to eat what scarce food it can get. The bear survived this long by eating the other bears in her cage. Skulls and carcasses litter the bombed-out remains of the zoo. In the last cage lies a dead tiger, so desperate for food it ripped the timbers of its cage for a final meal.
Weapons lie strewn along the Iraq-Kuwait border, left behind by armies after the Gulf War. It will be months before the physical remains of that war are cleared away, but CNN's Stefan Katsonis reports even before the debris from one conflict is cleared, another threatens.
A year and a half after the battle for Kuwait, the great desert expanse is littered with the explosive trash of war. Ammunition-filled bunkers and burst-open tanks are surrounded by swirls of shrapnel and unexploded cluster bombs.
Ordnance is everywhere. Places that you don't anticipate to find anything. You may find grenades laying on top of the ground, RPGs. You don't know what you're going to find.
All across the demilitarized zone that now separates Iraq and Kuwait, explosive ordnance disposal, or EOD teams, are working under contract to the Kuwaiti government. They are literally going over every acre of the desert to clear up the debris. By the time they're done, the entire length of the border will have been swept. A sea of red flags mark where little moments of the war lie buried, wound up and ready to go off. EOD expert Lane Neal says the sheer quantity of ammunition brought here by both sides was enormous. He says in this sense Saddam Hussein was right, that if Iraqi forces had held their ground, this may well have been the mother of all battles. Since most of the Iraqi weapons were never used, left buried in the sand, the greatest danger they face is from Allied ordnance.
They work very well. They have a built-in or an acceptable dud rate. So whenever they drop something of this nature, we're going to have to work on it.
Their technique is to fight fire with fire and blow up the bombs and bomblets. There have been scores of injuries and deaths among workers cleaning up the desert, although this company has so far been lucky. But there is a new danger. Iraq is only a mile away, and for the last 2 months, they say, tensions between Iraqi and Kuwaiti border forces have been mounting. Last week, there were 2 clashes between Iraqi and Kuwaiti units.
We see that both sides are beefing up their patrol outposts, both by manning and by fortifications around their posts.
These workers are caught between 2 unfriendly neighbors. Iraqi border guards have begun harassing the clearing teams.
We have, on occasion, had some volleys fired in our direction. We don't know specifically that they were shooting at us, but they were shot in our direction.
The American Chad Hall, who was held for 3 days by Iraqi authorities, works with these men. 2 co-workers, a Pakistani and a Filipino, have also been abducted and now face long prison terms in Iraq. United Nations observer teams monitor the demilitarized zone, but the cleanup crews say they aren't always much help. The UN is about to begin marking out the new borderline. Iraq will acquire some new land in the west, but Kuwait will gain several Iraqi oil wells and an old seaport. Iraq is not happy. It is expected the desert will be cleared of this enormous post-war mess by May. But even now, tensions run high along the frontier. The dispute between Iraq and Kuwait will probably continue long after the guns and bullets are swept away. Stefan Katsonis, CNN, in the demilitarized zone along the Iraq-Kuwaiti border.
And still to come this hour, the U.S. vice presidential candidates debate international issues in a campaign dominated by domestic concerns.
And Russian President Boris Yeltsin opens Russia's secret files on a Cold War tragedy.
I never worry about money now that I use Quicken.
With Quicken, all my finances are accurately organized in one place.
Yes, Quicken, the world's best-selling finance software and the fastest, easiest way to organize your home and small business finances. Quicken tracks bank accounts, investments, tax information, budgets, credit cards, and loans. And it's simple. If you can use a checkbook, you can use Quicken because your screen looks exactly like your checkbook. Just type in the payee, the amount, Quicken does the rest. Every transaction automatically categorized, so a keystroke gives you detailed reports like income and expenses, budgets, net worth, investment performance, and more. And Quicken's new financial planners help you plan funding for loans, college, and retirement.
Now we're organized.
With Quicken, we always know exactly where our money goes.
And exactly how much we have.
So, if you have a PC with DOS or Windows, call now to try Quicken free for 60 days. We won't charge your credit card unless you decide to keep Quicken. Call now.
1-800-759-4182.
Who are you going to call the most this month?
My grandparents in Philippines.
My uncle, Supermaniam, who lives in Agra, India.
With Sprint's new program, The Most, you automatically save 20% off whoever you call the most each month.
I call Wim in the Netherlands.
And with The Most, you can also choose a plan that lets you save 20% on international calls.
My mom in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia.
My sister in Munich.
My sister in Sri Lanka.
Doesn't anyone have relatives in Buffalo anymore?
Bill Clinton, the Democratic presidential hopeful, makes his final push for the White House. But what experience would he bring to the job? A Democracy in America special examines Clinton's 5 terms as governor of Arkansas, the battles he waged, his accomplishments, his record, and his leadership. An in-depth look at how Bill Clinton performed in office and what we might expect from him as president. Bill Clinton of Arkansas, Sunday, 10 p.m. Eastern on CNN.
The Bush administration confirms U.S. embassies in Britain and Norway searched their files for information on Democrat Bill Clinton's years as a graduate student in England. An official said the search found nothing. Clinton, jogging in Virginia, declined to respond to reporters' questions, pointing to his sore throat. But Democratic vice presidential candidate Al Gore called the report disturbing and outrageous. The order to search for Clinton's files came from an assistant secretary of state following Freedom of Information requests from some news organizations. Vice President Quayle says he's, quote, sure all the rules and regulations have been followed. Well, U.S. vice presidential candidates squared off last night. Their primary focus was how their administrations would handle domestic issues, but they also tried to convince voters they could handle international politics. We get more on that from CNN's World Affairs correspondent Ralph Begleiter.
Bill Clinton's running mate cast doubt on an agreement to eliminate some of the most dangerous long-range nuclear missiles reached in Washington last summer by Presidents Bush and Yeltsin. Democratic vice presidential candidate Al Gore pointed out that agreement has never been turned into a treaty, as Bush promised.
The deal unraveled, and now there is no start to deal at all. In fact, there are serious problems.
The President does have a commitment from Boris Yeltsin to eliminate the SS-18s. That is a commitment.
Is it an agreement?
It is a commitment, and let's talk about.
Well, he said
let's talk about.
Let him talk, Senator.
Just lighten up here, Al.
Quayle implied the Democrats, including Gore, had been soft on standing up to the Soviets.
We would not have won the Cold War if we had listened to Senator Gore and his crowd and had supported a nuclear freeze.
George Bush taking credit for the Berlin Wall coming down is like the rooster taking credit for the sunrise.
With the Cold War over, Gore called on Europeans to pay more for their own defense.
It is time for the Europeans, who are so much wealthier now and more powerful than they were at the end of World War II, to start picking up a little more of that tab themselves and not rely so exclusively on the United States taxpayers.
The Clinton campaign's plans for bigger cuts in U.S. defense spending drew a blunt hit from Ross Perot's running mate.
That should be eyed with great suspicion. People that are really kicking the props out from under our grand military establishment.
A 1989 coup attempt against Philippine President Corazon Aquino even figured in the U.S. vice presidential debate. Quayle claimed a previously undisclosed role in ending the coup while Bush was en route to a summit with Mikhail Gorbachev.
I had to go to the Situation Room. I had to assemble the president's advisors. I talked to President Aquino. I made the recommendation to the president. The president made the decision. The coup was suppressed. Democracy continued in the Philippines. The situation was ended.
International issues played only a small part in the debate among U.S. vice presidential candidates, but Gore and Clinton both tried to demonstrate that they are capable of handling world affairs in a crisis. Ralph Begletter, CNN, Washington.
The Russian government's feud with former Soviet President Mikhail Gorbachev forced him today to cancel a trip to Italy, although Moscow says he can still go to Germany to attend the funeral of former Chancellor Willy Brandt. Russian courts want Gorbachev to testify at a trial on the legality of the Communist Party. He refuses. The government today also linked Gorbachev to a cover-up of the Soviet massacre of Polish officers during World War II. It was under Gorbachev in 1990 that the Soviet Union finally admitted those killings. Russian President Boris Yeltsin today also shed light on another mystery from the days of Soviet rule, one that had severely strained Soviet relations with the U.S. and South Korea. CNN's Siobhan Darrow reports from Moscow.
Boris Yeltsin made good on a promise to unlock one of the Cold War's biggest mysteries, turning over to South Korean and U.S. delegations materials shedding light on the downing of KAL Flight 007.
We were sorry to find out from the secret files that during these 10 years, former Soviet leaders knew what happened, but were concealing the truth from the international community.
How much will be revealed from the documents is still unclear, but Boris Yeltsin described them as unique.
The full transcript of the black box, radio communication between the crew of the Korean Airlines and other air traffic, the onboard voice recorder, and conclusions from the Defense Ministry and KGB.
A U.S. spokesman congratulated Yeltsin for moving so fast, but one of the victim's family members said later there are still some questions he'd like answered.
Where are the bodies? Where are the remains of our loved ones? That has been the most painful question for all of our families.
The Korean airliner took off from New York on August 30th, 1983. The plane stopped to refuel in Anchorage, then headed off to its destination, Seoul. But it never arrived. After mysteriously entering Soviet airspace, the plane was shot down by a Soviet aircraft.
But what if I hadn't shot it down? What would have happened? What about the prestige of our country? At that time, the country was run by quite a different doctrine than it is now. We were told our borders were closed, no exceptions.
It may have been Soviet military prestige that was really at stake here.
The Soviet air defense system demonstrated that it was not reliable.
An investigative team from the newspaper Izvestia and independent filmmakers from several countries have sought answers for years now, filming the underwater wreckage in 1991. The team's film director explains the Soviet military had no choice but to shoot down the plane, having bungled by missing the aircraft after it had been flying over sensitive Soviet airspace for 2 hours.
So they tried their best to get him before he will cross the frontier waters, the frontier of the territory waters.
Because otherwise it
will be dismissed.
But questions remain about why the plane was so far off course for so long, with U.S. reconnaissance flights in the area aware of the Korean jetliner's whereabouts.
Our officials were ready to admit they shot down a passenger airplane and accept the consequences. But the Americans had to explain themselves and accept the blame for how the plane entered Soviet airspace.
But those were days when both sides spent more time trading blame than accepting it. This latest move by Boris Yeltsin seems designed to close one of the most chilling chapters of Cold War history. Siobhan Darrow, CNN, Moscow.
Political scandal ends the career of a powerful Japanese politician. That story just ahead.
Also, new freedom in Russia opens the old wound of racism. That and more when the International Hour continues.
Hey, there I go again.
Yeah, you always kept me going.
Dad, did you ever think to yourself, someday that little guy will have his own baby?
No, not really.
I was too busy thinking, how can I afford to raise this kid?
Yeah, that's what I've been thinking about with Brian. How can I afford it?
Well, I'll tell you how I did it.
Since 1928, families have invested with Scudder, America's first family of no-load funds.
Ever wonder why Bay's English muffins taste so good? Here's why. Spring wheat flour and whole milk from Minnesota. Sugar from Hawaii. Butter from Wisconsin. Potato flour from Idaho. Bay's flavor is locked in by the finest packaging available. Bay's English muffins. In your grocer's dairy case. Bay's.
Make your Caribbean vacation the best it can be. Book Barbados. See your travel agent or call 1-800-221-9831. Barbados, the best it can be.
It's gone. But it isn't.
Now you can get strong medicine in a cough drop.
It's gone, but it's still working.
Medicine's so effective, the drop keeps working even after it's gone. It's extra strength Vicks, with a full dose of Vicks vapor medicine in every drop to relieve your cough and help your scratchy throat and stuffy nose feel better. Extra strength Vicks, so strong it keeps working even after the drop is gone.
It's still working.
Japan's most powerful politician resigned from parliament today, virtually hounded from office by an angry public. This after Shin Kanemaru received just a slap on the wrist for serious campaign violations. CNN's Eileen O'Connor reports.
After another day of crisis meetings, Japanese political leaders were told Kanemaru's decision was final. The shadow shogun operating as his custom, sliding past the press to submit his resignation from the Diet, saying he alone should take responsibility for his crime of accepting some $4 million in illegal political contributions. Prime Minister Kiichi Miyazawa carried on with business as usual, meeting U.S. Federal Reserve Chairman Alan Greenspan in Tokyo. The resignation of his political mentor could lead to further probes, which could implicate some of Miyazawa's own cabinet. Though worrying, Miyazawa put on a brave face.
I think basically Miyazawa sits on a very shaky stool at the moment. It's very likely that at least 5 or 8 of his current cabinet members will have received some money from the Sakawa Cuban scandal via Kanemaru.
Public outcry against Kanemaru has reached a fever pitch. Yet few feel this will lead to real change in the pork barrel politics common to Japan.
If you remember the recruit scandal of 2 years ago, everybody was talking about political reform, and there were a couple of political reform bills, and there was a lot of action about them, but then things went back to normal and nothing happened.
The Japanese media is already showing political obituaries on Kanemaru, yet it is still unclear as to how this will affect his power, given how deeply his connections run throughout Japanese politics.
The fact that it was a person as powerful as Shin Kanemaru to take the fall is perhaps the biggest surprise in this scandal. With the public outcry continuing, the question now is, who will be next? Eileen O'Connor, CNN, Tokyo.
For the first time since World War II, a Japanese military contingent has been fully deployed overseas. About 450 Japanese troops arrived in Cambodia today, completing Japan's contribution to a United Nations peacekeeping force. A controversial new Japanese law allows troops to deploy overseas, but limits their duties to non-combat roles. Some 15,000 troops from more than 40 countries are working to keep the peace between the Khmer Rouge forces and Cambodia's Vietnamese-installed government.
Jordan's King Hussein visited Egypt today, his first trip to that country since the Gulf War. In the Gulf crisis, he was welcomed to Cairo by Egyptian President Hosni Mubarak. During talks, the Jordanian leader offered condolences for Monday's disastrous earthquake in Cairo. Relations between Egypt and Amman became strained when Jordan appeared to sympathize with Iraq after its invasion of Kuwait back in 1990. Before that time, the two countries were close allies. Today's talks reportedly covered bilateral relations and Arab issues. scientists from California and France see their research pay off in a big way. We'll have details on the naming of this year's winners of the Nobel Science Awards.
And we'll take a look at the biggest building boom in Europe in almost 50 years.
Flying? Flying? This is how to fly.
Nice try, but this is how you fly.
That's not flying. This is flying.
This is how to fly.
They call that flying. Wrong. Northwest is flying.
Fly Northwest across the Pacific to Australia and more cities in Asia than any U.S. airline.
It was unreal. You woke up with morning breath. You were meeting Miss Wonderful for breakfast, and instead of minty fresh scope, where's my scope? There was something from the medicine-y mouthwash. It looked blue, but it still smelled somewhat medicine-y. I need my scope. It's okay. Relax. It was all a dream. You do have scope. It's minty through and kills 90% of morning breath bacteria. So you use minty fresh scope, and you kiss morning breath goodbye.
Do we have pictures?
Long John to go.
Go fish!
Hey, hey, did you know it's hot when you move, it's hot when you're not?
Hey, hey, go fish to go!
Now you can go for great tasting fish, tender chicken, and shrimp to go from Long John Silver's.
You're gonna get your wish. Hey, hey,
go fish!
You're on! Go for 3 delicious shrimp, batter-dipped fish, all just $1.99. And don't forget to add a piece.
President Bush promises Jim Baker would lead domestic policy in a second term. How much difference can that make? Plus, super lawyer Alan Dershowitz. Tonight, Larry King Live, 9 Eastern on CNN.
The Royal Swedish Academy of Sciences handed out the Nobel Prizes in physics and chemistry today. French scientist Georges Charpak won the physics prize. He was honored for his invention of particle detectors, which explore the innermost parts of matter. When told of the $1 million+ prize, he reportedly replied, "Great, then I can buy a new pair of shoes this afternoon." Meanwhile, California researcher Rudolf Marcus was honored in chemistry for his theoretical work on electron transfer reactions in chemical systems.
Parliamentary officials in France today voted to reject an effort to impeach and try former French Prime Minister Laurent Fabius. Along with 2 other former ministers, Fabius was named in a scandal over AIDS-contaminated blood. 4 senior health officials are awaiting a verdict in a trial in which they're accused of fraud and criminal negligence. They were accused following the infection of hundreds of people with AIDS-contaminated blood. And ahead on CNN World Report, Filipino President Fidel Ramos disarms his opponents by introducing reforms and legalizing groups such as the Communist Party. A look at his first 100 days in office.
And not all the money in Switzerland is tied up in those super secret bank accounts. We'll have those stories and more, of course, coming up on CNN World Report.
State finals coming up. A lot of pressure to win. I don't eat right, I get irregular, so I don't project a winning attitude, and the boys see that. I tried some natural bulk fiber, but I couldn't take all that grit. Then I discovered Sunrise Smooth Metamucil. No grit in the mix, or the taste. Easy to get the extra fiber I need every day to stay regular. You got a winning attitude, you win, if you're lucky.
Metamucil, and you could stay regular for the rest of your life.
V8 has vegetables in it.
Really? I didn't know that. Vegetables in it. I heard that. Here's why I drink it.
Because it's tasty.
I love vegetables.
You hate vegetables.
I like these. They kind of crush it all up, squish together, and you can actually taste the vegetables. You know, your tomatoes,
Spinach, celery,
carrots. It's got vegetables in it?
yes.
V8? V8! You know, when I feel like a vegetable, I drink it.
It's zippy kind of thing, a zippy thing.
International Hour continues, followed by Early Prime after this local commercial break. Next on CNN.
My heating system, it's down there purring like a kitten. Things solid as a rock. Never think about it.
The best time to think about your heating system is now. So call your Carrier dealer today. We're the guys who know best when it comes to making it better inside.
Get up to $1,000 in rebates and a 5-year parts and labor warranty on a total Carrier Comfort combo. Call us, Bell Brothers Heating and Air Conditioning.